Welcome to my channel, The World of Science Fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.
The plasma strike vaporized the morning market in a sphere of white-hot destruction, and 12-year-old Tira watched her world end through tears that refracted the light into prismatic nightmares. The sound arrived a heartbeat later, not an explosion but an inverse thunder, as if the universe itself had inhaled sharply, pulling matter and meaning into a singular point of annihilation. Moments before, she had been etching patterns in the rust-colored dust outside her family's dwelling, her cerulean fingers gripping a worn stick carved from native thornwood. The morning air had tasted of copper and wildflowers, that peculiar combination unique to Keros during the bloom season, when microscopic pollen mixed with mineral deposits carried on the wind. Her drawing had been taking shape with careful precision, a figure standing upright on two legs, possessing the strange bilateral symmetry of the creatures from her grandmother's whispered stories. The beings she drew had no tail for balance, no secondary arms for stability, no protective ridges or scales, just smooth skin that the tales claimed could range from pale as morning clouds to dark as fertile soil. 5 fingers on each hand, an odd number that seemed to violate the natural preference for even digits among every species she knew. Rounded ears that couldn't swivel to track sound, eyes that faced only forward, sacrificing peripheral vision for something the stories called depth perception, a human. Though speaking the word aloud invited skepticism from anyone old enough to have surrendered their imagination to the weight of sanctioned reality. Now that careful drawing scattered in the superheated wind as another column of plasma descended from the orange sky, turning the school where she'd first seen the ancient tablets into a crater of molten glass. The building's composite materials underwent instant phase transition, solid to gas without pause for liquid, leaving behind a perfectly smooth depression that reflected the horror above in its obsidian surface. She could see herself in that terrible mirror, small, blue, her 2 eyes wide with the particular terror of a child discovering that safety had always been an illusion. Tyra! Her mother's voice cut through the cacophony, a sound Tira would replay in her memory for decades to come, always wondering if she could have run faster, if those 3 seconds might have made a difference. She saw her parents emerge from their dwelling, her father's 4 arms already reaching for her, each hand splayed in desperate urgency. Her mother's face bore an expression that transcended species, that spoke to something primal, shared by all sentient beings, facing the incomprehensible fact of their own ending. The third strike landed between them with surgical precision, as if guided by an intelligence that understood exactly how to maximize suffering. The heat wave threw Tira backward, her skin's chromatophores firing in chaotic patterns, trying to adapt to a temperature differential that exceeded their evolutionary parameters. When her vision cleared, when the photoreceptors in both her eyes finally agreed on a single interpretation of reality, the dwelling where she'd spent 12 cycles learning the rhythm of safety had been replaced by shadows burned into stone. The silhouettes were almost artistic in their clarity, her father's 4 arms still reaching, her mother's form bent forward in a posture of protection that had protected nothing. No! The scream tore from her throat in harmonics her species used for mourning, frequencies that carried across the settlement and told everyone who heard them that another family line had been severed. Jork's strong arms caught her before she could stumble toward the expanding ring of heat that marked the boundary between existence and absence. The settlement's security chief had served for 40 cycles, his blue skin bearing the darker patterns of age and the geometric scars of old battles. She felt him trembling as he pulled her back. This warrior who'd faced pirates and predators, reduced to shaking by the methodical extermination of everything they'd sworn to protect. "They're gone, child," he said, his voice cracking across multiple registers. "We have to move. The Confederation, they're not responding to hails. They're killing everyone." Through the smoke that now painted the world in gradients of ending, Tira saw something impossible descending, a capsule no larger than a transport pod, moving with deliberate precision through the chaos. Its hull bore no markings she recognized from her studies of galactic vessels. The design seemed both primitive and advanced, as if someone had taken ancient principles and expressed them through technology that hadn't existed when those principles were first conceived. It landed in what remained of the central plaza with a grace that seemed obscene against the backdrop of systematic destruction. The landing struts absorbed the impact with hydraulic precision, and steam vented from thermal exchangers that glowed cherry red from atmospheric entry. The hatch opened with a pneumatic sigh that somehow carried over the screaming, over the collapse of buildings, over the crackle of fires feeding on a century of accumulated life. The figure that emerged moved through smoke with the economy of someone who had walked through many endings. 2 legs carried it forward, no tail for balance, no additional arms for stability. Just the bipedal stride of her morning's drawing made manifest, complete with armor that bore a symbol she'd seen in the forbidden sections of the historical archive. A star surrounded by stripes, rendered in colors that had no names in her language, but that her eyes interpreted as something between blood and sky. The being's helmet retracted with a series of mechanical clicks, revealing a face that should have been alien, but instead felt like recognition, like déjà vu made flesh. Skin the color of wet sand, weathered by radiation and time. Eyes that held only 2 pupils, but somehow seemed to see more than they should. Hair cut short in what might have been military precision, or might have been pragmatism, or might have been grief. Survivors, the being said in accented galactic standard, the words shaped by a throat that had evolved under different atmospheric pressures, creating subtle tonal variations that marked it as other. This way, we don't have much time. The second wave will glass everything in 3 minutes. Tira found herself stepping forward despite Jorik's protective grip, her voice emerging in a whisper that carried the weight of collapsed certainties. You're real? You're actually real. The human, for what else could it be, turned toward her, and she saw his expression shift through surprise, recognition, and something that might have been hope, or might have been sorrow, or might have been both. I'm real, little one, he said, and knelt despite the seconds ticking toward annihilation, bringing himself to her eye level in a gesture that would define both their futures. Captain Marcus Reed, Terran Resistance Force. I came as soon as the blockade fell. His gaze swept the burning settlement, taking in the scope of destruction with eyes that had seen too much but hadn't yet learned to stop looking. I'm sorry I'm too late for most of them. They were just there, Tira heard herself say, the words emerging broken like the settlement around them, each syllable a shard of what language used to mean before the world ended. My parents, they were reaching for me, and then they became shadows. How do people become shadows? I know. His hand extended toward her, 5 fingers spread in invitation, that odd number that violated symmetry, but somehow created its own balance. But I need you to be brave now. Can you do that? Can you trust me? Jorik's weapon was drawn but not quite aimed, the barrel wavering between threat assessment and impossibility. The humans are extinct, gone for 2 centuries. Your stories we tell children when we want them to believe in impossible things? Quarantined, Marcus corrected, standing smoothly while keeping his hand extended toward Tira. The movement was fluid, practiced, speaking of training that had been maintained even in captivity. The Confederation kept Earth and all human colonies in a containment zone for 200 years. They told the galaxy we were extinct, victims of a plague that made us too dangerous to release. They told us the galaxy wanted us dead, that we were universally hated. Both were lies maintained by orbital weapons platforms that vaporized anything trying to leave or enter. We've been prisoners, not corpses. Another explosion. Closer, the ground beneath them developing fractures that glowed with heat from below, as if the planet itself was bleeding light. The air temperature rose 15 degrees in 2 seconds, and Tira's respiratory system began producing protective mucus, an autonomic response to environmental threat. She grabbed Marcus's hand, surprised by its warmth and the strange smoothness of skin that had never needed scales for protection. The contact sent information flooding through her nervous system. Here was proof of the other, of stories made real, of hope wearing flesh and moving through smoke toward survival. His pulse was wrong, too slow for the situation, as if his species processed danger differently. She could feel calluses that spoke of weapons held and tools used, a geography of experience written in hardened skin. Tira, she said, offering her name like a gift or a prayer or a promise. Tira, I need you to show me something. Are there others who remember? Others who kept the stories of humans alive? The question seemed absurd against the backdrop of ending, but she found herself nodding, her mind latching onto purpose as an alternative to grief. The memory cave. where we keep the old things. The things the Confederation says never existed. Show me. Quickly. They ran through streets transforming into hell. Jorek following despite his protests that this was madness, that trusting myths while reality burned was the definition of insanity. But Tira felt the human's hand in hers. Solid, real, pulling her through smoke towards something that might be survival or might be a different kind of ending, but was definitely not the passive acceptance of annihilation. The settlement she'd known all her life underwent metamorphosis around them. The bakery where she'd bought sweet rolls every 7th day became a pillar of fire. The fountain where children played, where she had played just yesterday, boiled away in seconds, leaving mineral deposits that looked like frozen screams. Bodies lay in the streets, some burning, some simply gone, reduced to their component atoms by direct plasma strikes. She recognized faces despite the damage. Her teacher who'd shown her the ancient tablets, the merchant who always gave her extra fruit, the storyteller who gathered children in the evening to share tales that the Confederation hadn't yet thought to. Forbidden. The memory cave existed where architecture met geology, carved into the natural rock formation that had sheltered her people's stories for generations. The entrance had partially collapsed from the bombardment's seismic effects, rocks scattered like broken teeth, but a gap remained, a mouth speaking secrets into the burning air. In here, Tira gasped, pulling Marcus through the opening. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 3 steps, and her eyes adjusted to the darkness, both pupils dilating in sequence. What they revealed stopped Marcus mid-stride. The cave's interior had been converted into a repository generations ago. Shelves carved from living rock with tools that predated modern technology. But it wasn't the architecture that stole breath. It was what covered every surface. Hundreds upon hundreds of drawings, accumulated over decades, possibly centuries. Children's artwork rendered in every medium available. Chalk, paint, carved reliefs, holographic projections that flickered with age. All depicting the same impossible subjects. Beings with 2 legs, rounded ears, 5 fingers. Humans, drawn by young hands that had never seen one. Working from stories passed down like genetic memory. Like hope encoded in the space between what was and what might be. Marcus reached out with trembling fingers to touch a drawing that might have been a century old. A child's rendering of a human and a Corosian child playing together beneath stars, arranged in no real constellation, but that spoke to a configuration of possibility. The paper, actual paper, not synthetic material, crumbled slightly at his touch, releasing the scent of age and preservation chemicals. "Generations of you," he whispered, his voice carrying harmonics of recognition and something that might have been grief for all the time lost, all the connections severed. "You remembered us when forgetting would have been easier, when remembering might have been death. We drew you to make you real," Tira said, her voice small in the cave's embrace but carrying the weight of generations. "Grandmother said that even when the galaxy tells you something is impossible, you hold on to it harder. You draw it, you speak it, you refuse to let it die. She said humans were the proof that different didn't mean dangerous, that the galaxy had been bigger when you were in it." Marcus pulled something from his pack, a device that began emitting a soft blue glow as it scanned the cave's contents. The light played across the drawings, making them seem to move, as if all the imagined humans were taking their first breath. "What are you doing?" Jorek demanded from the entrance, his bulk blocking some of the hellish light from outside. "Creating evidence," Marcus replied as the device worked. Quantum processors cataloging every line, every color, every desperate attempt to preserve what the galaxy had been ordered to forget. These aren't just drawings. They're proof that the Confederation didn't just quarantine humans. They tried to erase the memory of us. They made remembering us a crime punishable by... He gestured toward the burning settlement visible through the cave's entrance. "Upload complete," the device announced in a voice that seemed too calm for the circumstances. "All data transmitted to Resistance Fleet. Compression ratio optimal. Signal boost confirmed through 17 relay points." "Fleet?" Jorek's voice cracked on the word. All his soldiers' training insufficient for processing this scale of impossibility. Marcus allowed himself a smile that contained no joy, only the satisfaction of promises kept across impossible spans of time. "Did you think I came alone? We've been preparing for 2 centuries, building in the spaces between monitored zones. in the asteroid fields where sensors couldn't reach, in the hollowed-out moons of gas giants. Every human who remembered freedom, every child born in captivity who refused to accept cages as natural, we've all been working toward this moment. The blockade's collapse wasn't random. We brought it down with synchronized strikes on 17 key platforms, viruses that had been evolving in isolation for decades, waiting for the right moment to wake up. The ground shook, the second wave beginning its work of transformation, turning solid matter into component atoms, ensuring nothing would remain to testify that people had once lived here, had once dared to remember forbidden things. They emerged from the cave to find the world transformed into something from the old paintings of hell. Fire and smoke, and the sound of matter surrendering its coherence to energy. But through that chaos, Tira saw shapes descending that didn't belong to the Confederation's brutal geometry. Sleeker vessels bearing the star and stripes symbol, moving with purpose through the destruction. Their design spoke of evolution under pressure, of technology developed in secret, of innovation born from necessity. Extraction teams, Marcus explained, speaking into his communicator in rapid English, a language Tira recognized from the oldest recordings, the ones that preceded the separation. He switched back to standard, his accent more pronounced now, stress revealing the linguistic foundations beneath his careful pronunciation. Priority evacuation of all survivors. These people preserved our memory when the galaxy was taught to forget. They're heroes whether they know it or not. The next minutes blurred into a symphony of salvation and loss. Humans in similar armor emerged from landed capsules, moving with practiced efficiency through the rubble. They pulled survivors from collapsed structures with equipment that seemed designed for exactly this purpose, as if they'd been planning for rescue as long as they'd been planning for escape. They carried the wounded toward evacuation vessels with a gentleness that seemed at odds with their military bearing, speaking in soothing tones in languages Tira didn't recognize, but somehow understood, the universal vocabulary of compassion. A Confederation patrol craft descended through the smoke, its weapons charging with the distinctive whine of particle acceleration, a sound that every settlement child learned to fear before they learned to speak. Before it could fire, one of the human ships engaged it. The ensuing dogfight painted tracers across the burning sky. Humanity's return written in condensed light and tactical violence. The human pilot flew with a desperation that transcended training, each maneuver speaking of freedom fought for rather than granted. This way, Marcus led them toward a larger vessel, its cargo hold already filling with survivors. Tira recognized faces despite the ash and terror, her teacher clutching a data pad containing the settlement's historical archives. Neighbors whose children had drawn beside her in the dust, the old storyteller still mumbling tales even in shock, as if narrative was his only anchor to sanity. A voice rang out across the destruction, amplified and distorted by combat speakers. "Human, you're too late." A Confederation commander stood amid the rubble, his unit's weapons trained on the evacuation ship. His armor bore the scarlet marks of authority, the geometric patterns that indicated power in their rigid hierarchy. But his laugh carried the edge of someone watching their worldview collapse into rubble as surely as the settlement around them. 2 centuries we kept you contained, he continued, his voice rising to compete with the flames. 2 centuries of peace without your chaos, your unpredictability, your refusal to accept the natural order. The galaxy functioned perfectly without you. And now at the end, you come to play hero? You arrive just in time to watch the consequences of remembering you? Stand down, Marcus ordered, his weapon raised but his voice carrying something deeper than threat. A weight of history, of patience exhausted, of rage transformed into purpose. These people are under Terran protection now. Terran protection? The commander's laugh grew louder, more unhinged, echoing off the burning buildings in harmonics that spoke of madness. Your myths, stories for children. No one will believe you've returned. We've spent 2 centuries ensuring that. What happened next would be debated in historical documents for centuries, analyzed by scholars trying to understand how a single moment could pivot the trajectory of galactic civilization. Tira stepped forward, moving between Marcus and the Confederation soldiers. Her small blue form seemed impossibly fragile against the backdrop of military might in burning homes, like a flower standing before a storm. But her voice when it emerged carried clearly across the destruction. If you kill him, you kill the last story of our people. You kill the proof that hope can be real, even when the powerful tell us it's just a fairy tale for children too young to know better. The commander's weapon swiveled toward her, its barrel seeming enormous from her perspective. She saw herself reflected in its polished surface, small, blue, covered in ash in her parents' absence, but standing nonetheless. Child, you don't understand the politics at play here. The humans were contained for good reason. They're dangerous, unpredictable. More dangerous than this. Tira gestured at the settlement, at the carbonized shadows where people had been, at the memory cave now collapsing behind them, taking centuries of hidden truth with it. You came to kill us because we remembered them, because we dared to hope they might return, because children drew pictures in dust. What could be more dangerous than a government that murders families for the crime of imagination? The truth, Marcus said quietly, stepping beside her, his presence solid and warm and impossible. That's what you're really afraid of. The truth that you've kept billions in chains with lies, that you destroyed entire cultures to maintain control, that your peace was built on the graves of everyone who asked uncomfortable questions? The commander's finger moved toward the trigger, but the shot that rang out came from behind Tira. Jork stood with his weapon still raised, smoke drifting from its barrel, his aim true despite his shaking hands. The commander fell with an expression of surprise, as if he'd never considered that his authority might not be absolute. No one, Jork said to the remaining Confederation soldiers, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd found their limit, threatens our children, not the Confederation, not anyone, not for any ideology or political structure or convenient lie. One by one, the soldiers lowered their weapons, their postures speaking of a different kind of surrender, not to force, but to the recognition that they'd become something they'd never intended. Several removed their helmets, revealing faces from a dozen different species, all young, all carrying the same expression of dawning horror at what they'd been part of. Marcus activated something on his wrist, and his voice boomed across the settlement, carried by hidden speakers on the rescue ships and emergency broadcast protocols that overrode local communications. Attention all survivors. This is Captain Marcus Reed of the Terran Resistance. We have not forgotten you. For 200 years we were told the galaxy feared and hated us. You were told we were extinct. Both were lies meant to keep us apart, to prevent the unity that tyrants fear most. The recognition that different doesn't mean enemy, that variation strengthens rather than threatens. More survivors emerged from hiding places, from bunkers that hadn't been marked on official maps, from shelters built by people who'd learned to expect betrayal from those claiming to protect them. Their faces bore the same expression, hope and terror in equal measure, the vertigo of discovering that the impossible had always been possible, just hidden. As they boarded the evacuation vessel, Tira clutched the only item she'd managed to save, a small drawing her grandmother had made years ago on fabric that had survived 100 washings. It showed a human and a Corosian child holding hands beneath stars, arranged in no constellation that existed, but that spoke to a navigation beyond astronomy, a mapping of possibility rather than position. Marcus noticed it as they found seats in the crowded hold, the ship already lifting off, leaving the burning world behind, but carrying its memory forward. The acceleration pressed them into their seats, and through the viewport, Tira watched her world shrink, becoming just another point of light among millions. But something else was becoming visible. Ships emerging from cloaked positions, hundreds of them. Their designs speaking of different evolutionary paths, different solutions to the problem of moving through vacuum. Your grandmother's drawing? Marcus asked, his voice gentle despite the weight of command he carried. Tira nodded. She said she saw a human once, when she was very young, before the separation. No one believed her. They said she was confused, that she'd imagined it, that trauma from the early conflicts had affected her memory. What was their name? She never knew, but she said they gave her something. Tira reached into her pocket, pulling out a small metal pin, tarnished with age but still bearing the star and stripes symbol clearly. The metal was warm from her body heat, carrying the oils of generations of handling. She said to keep it safe, that someday someone would come looking for it. Marcus took the pin with fingers that trembled despite his soldier's control. He turned it over, reading the inscription on the back, and Tira saw something fundamental shift in his expression. The moment when coincidence reveals itself as destiny, when random threads show their weaving. Lieutenant Sarah Reed, he read aloud, his voice barely audible over the ship's engines. My grandmother. She was on the last diplomatic mission before the blockade, trying to prevent what couldn't be prevented. He looked at Tira with something approaching awe. She wrote in her journals about a blue-skinned child she met, who drew pictures in the dust while the adults argued about treaties. She gave her this pin and promised humans would return, even if it took centuries. 200 years, Tira whispered, understanding the weight of time differently now, not as absence but as persistence, as promise kept despite impossible odds. Your grandmother's promise to mine. Through the viewport, the full scope of what was happening became clear. It wasn't just human ships emerging from hidden positions. The crystalline sculptures of the Altarians caught light like prisms, their vessels grown rather than built, living creatures modified for vacuum. The bioships of the Verdani pulsed with bioluminescence, their hulls breathing in patterns that might have been communication or might have been joy. The sleek predator forms of the Nexari moved in hunting formations that had been adapted for warfare, their ancestral pack behaviors translated into three-dimensional combat maneuvers. The blockade falling wasn't the beginning, Marcus explained, standing beside her at the viewport. It was the signal. Every ship we could build, every human who remembered what we were before the cage, but also every species that had suffered under Confederation control. Every world that had been told they were alone in their resistance. 200 years of secret communications, messages hidden in quantum static, meetings in the spaces between map systems, alliances built one encrypted transmission at a time. The blockade didn't just free humanity. It was the fuse for revolution across the galaxy. An alarm sounded. Confederation battleships emerging from hyperspace, their massive forms blotting out stars. But as they oriented for attack, space around them began to shimmer. More ships emerged, dozens, then hundreds, representing every species that had been separated, controlled, diminished by Confederation policies. The battleships found themselves outnumbered 10-1, their weapon systems being jammed by technologies they didn't recognize, developed in isolation by species they'd never thought capable of innovation. After a moment that stretched like held breath, the Confederation ships jumped back to hyperspace, fleeing the impossible made manifest. Their retreat sent ripples through local spacetime, gravitational waves that the various species sensors interpreted as victory. A communication came through the ship's speakers, not just Marcus's voice, but dozens, in languages Tira recognized and many she didn't. The universal translator worked overtime, creating a chorus of meaning. To all beings hearing this transmission, we are the Free Systems Alliance, human, Altarian, Verdani, Nexari, Corosian, and dozens more. We stand together against the lies that divided us. The Confederation told you humans were extinct, that we were the ancient threat that justified their control. They told humans the galaxy despised us, that we were universally hated for our chaos and unpredictability. They told all of us that unity was dangerous, that isolation was safety, that walls were wisdom. But a child on Karos drew humans in the dust, keeping hope alive. Children on Earth drew aliens in their notebooks, imagining the friends they'd meet among the stars. Art, stories, dreams. These are the weapons tyrants fear most, because they remind us that the walls in our minds are the only ones that truly trap us. The evacuation ship docked with a massive carrier, its design clearly cobbled together from technologies that had never been meant to interface, human systems grafted onto Altarian frameworks, Verdani biological components merged with Nexari weapon systems. It was ugly and beautiful simultaneously, a testament to cooperation born from necessity rather than aesthetic consideration. Tira found herself in a hangar that defied every segregation law she'd been taught. Humans working alongside species she'd only seen in educational programs, warning about their dangers. The air filled with a dozen languages creating a symphony of cooperation, universal translators struggling to keep up with technical jargon that had evolved in isolation and now needed to be reconciled. She saw a human engineer arguing with an Altarian about optimal power distribution, their hands moving in gestures that transcended language. A Verdani medic tended to wounded of every species with tendrils that delivered species-specific medications. Nexari warriors stood guard alongside human soldiers, their different combat philosophies creating a defense that was stronger for its diversity. Admiral Lin Jiang approached them through the organized chaos, her presence carrying an authority different from the Confederation's displays of power, something earned rather than imposed. Her uniform bore scars from combat, repairs made with materials that weren't quite the right color. Speaking of resources stretched thin, but determination stretched further. She knelt before Tira, creating that same eye-level connection Marcus had established in the burning settlement. "Marcus told me about you," she said, her standard accented differently than his, suggesting she'd learned it from different sources in different circumstances. "About all of you who kept our memory alive when forgetting would have been safer. We've prepared a place for your people on Haven Station. It's not home, we know that, but it's yours for as long as you need it." "What about our world?" someone called out, one of Tira's neighbors clutching two children who'd lost their parents in the bombardment. "The Confederation destroyed everything. Our homes, our history, our dead." Admiral Zhang stood, addressing the crowd of survivors who'd gathered, their faces reflecting loss and confusion in equal measure. "Worlds can be rebuilt. What can't be replaced are the people, the stories, the memories. You saved those. You saved us, in a way. By remembering humanity when the galaxy was told to forget, you kept the idea of us alive. Ideas are harder to kill than people, harder to contain than fleets. You were our anchor in reality when they tried to make us fiction." In the weeks that followed, Tira found herself at the center of something unprecedented. The drawings from the memory cave became symbols broadcast across the galaxy. Proof that truth persists despite oppression, that hope can survive in the margins of authoritarian control, that children's art could be revolutionary. Her story spread through networks both official and underground, translated into languages she couldn't pronounce, inspiring resistance on worlds she'd never heard of. The image of her standing between Marcus and the Confederation soldiers became iconic, reprinted on everything from protest signs to currency and liberated systems. Haven Station existed in an unmapped nebula, its location hidden in the space between official reality and necessary truth. The station itself was another hybrid construction, modules from different species connected by passages that accommodated various atmospheric needs, gravities, and lighting spectrums. Through her window, Tira watched gases swirl in colors that had no names in her language, creating patterns that reminded her of her grandmother's stories about the time before walls, when beings moved freely between stars, when difference was celebrated rather than feared. She was given quarters in the human section initially, but soon found herself moving between different areas, her young mind adapting quickly to various gravities and atmospheres. She learned that Altarian crystals sang when happy, that Verdani bioluminescence could express complex emotions, that Nexari pack-hunting behaviors translated into beautiful coordinated dances during their celebrations. Marcus visited often, bringing reports of the revolution spreading like a benevolent virus through Confederation space. Each world that declared independence weakened the control mechanisms, made the next liberation easier. The economic systems that had depended on enforced separation began to collapse as species rediscovered the benefits of trade and cultural exchange. Technologies that had been developed in isolation were shared, creating innovations that no single species could have achieved alone. "Why did children keep drawing humans when adults stopped believing?" Tira asked one day, as they sat in the station's observation deck watching the nebula's slow dance. She'd been thinking about it constantly, trying to understand why her generation had preserved what their parents had tried to forget. Marcus considered the question with the attention of someone who'd learned that children's questions often contain the seeds of revolution. Maybe because children haven't learned yet what's impossible, they draw what they want to be true, not what they're told is true. They haven't internalized the walls that adults accept as natural. And sometimes that refusal to accept limitation is enough to keep truth alive until it can emerge again. "But it was dangerous," Tira pressed. "The Confederation could have punished us, did punish us in the end." "The most important truths usually are dangerous," Marcus replied. "To someone anyway. The question is whether they're dangerous to oppressors or the oppressed. Your drawings were dangerous to the Confederation because they proved their fundamental lie, that separation was natural, that unity was impossible, that we were better apart than together. They were interrupted by an alert, not an alarm, but an announcement that would reshape the galaxy's structure. The Confederation had agreed to peace talks, not from a position of strength, but recognition that their control was evaporating faster than they could respond to. Entire sectors were declaring independence daily, their military forces were defecting en masse, and the economic foundations of their power were crumbling. The negotiations took place on a neutral station, broadcast to every inhabited world. Tira watched from Haven as representatives of dozens of species sat at the same table for the first time in centuries. The Confederation delegates looked diminished, their elaborate uniforms and ceremonial weapons seeming like costumes now, props from a play whose run had ended. When Confederation representatives claimed their quarantines were for public safety, the Alliance presented the drawings from Keros, generation after generation of children keeping hope alive, their art becoming evidence of systematic cultural suppression. When they argued humans were too dangerous to integrate, testimonies poured in from worlds where humans had already lived in secret, peaceful and productive members of their communities who'd been hiding their species for generations. You based your entire power structure on lies, the Altarian ambassador said during one broadcast session, their crystalline form resonating with harmonics that conveyed disgust. You told us the humans were dangerous, while you were the ones bombing settlements for remembering them. The Confederation's lead delegate, an ancient being whose species had ruled for millennia, responded with words that would echo through history. We believed our own lies, repeated them so often that we forgot they were fabrications. The quarantines became tradition, the fear became doctrine. We destroyed records that contradicted our narrative until we couldn't remember why we started. The bureaucracy of oppression became self-sustaining, requiring no conscious evil, only compliance. Then you understand, Admiral Zhang replied, why this government must end. Not just change, but completely dissolve. Something new must rise, built on truth and equal representation. The vote to dissolve the Confederation and establish the Galactic Council was unanimous. Even the Confederation delegates recognizing that their time had passed, that lies have a half-life and theirs had finally decayed to nothing. The day the quarantines officially ended, Earth appeared on the main screen. A blue marble that humans hadn't been able to leave for 2 centuries, now free to rejoin a galaxy that was learning to remember them. Ships poured out and in, carrying reunion and curiosity in equal measure. The first vessels to land on Earth in 200 years brought representatives from every species in the Alliance, while human ships departed for worlds they'd only dreamed of seeing. Years passed. The settlement on Keros was rebuilt, not as it had been, but as something new, the first interspecies education center, its architecture a fusion of styles that had never been allowed to touch. Corrosion domes intersected with human rectangular structures, Altarian crystal growths provided natural lighting, Verdani biosculptures created living walls that purified air and generated oxygen. It was chaotic and beautiful, a physical manifestation of unity through diversity. Tira, now grown, stood at its entrance on opening day. Her skin had darkened to the deep blue of maturity, and her 2 eyes had gained the ability to see spectrums that children couldn't perceive. She wore clothing that combined elements from different cultures, human denim, Corrosion ceremonial sashes, an Altarian crystal pendant that sang quietly when she moved. Children of every species poured through doors that would never be segregated, their laughter creating a harmony that needed no translation. She watched a human child help a young Nexari with a puzzle that required 5-fingered manipulation, while a Corrosian taught an Altarian child to draw in the dust with the same stick Tira had once used. In the center's main hall hung the preserved drawings from the memory cave, alongside new artwork created by the first students, past and future in conversation, showing that revolution wasn't about destroying the past, but about liberating the future from its constraints. A holographic display showed the evolution of the drawings over time, how each generation had added details, had made humans more real through accumulated imagination. Marcus attended the ceremony, gray now threading through his hair, marking time in the way humans did. His face bore new lines, carved by responsibility and loss, and the weight of helping rebuild a galaxy. After Tira's speech, where she told the story of the day humanity returned to Keros, he found her standing before the memorial wall that bore the names of all who had died in the bombardment. You left out the part where you were drawing me in the dust when the bombs fell, he noted, his voice carrying the warm rasp of age. Some truths are too perfect, she replied, tracing her parents' names with one finger. They sound like fiction even when they're fact. People need to believe the story more than they need every detail to be verified. She pulled out her grandmother's drawing, now framed in the education center's first classroom, protected by preservation fields that would keep it stable for centuries. Your grandmother's journals, the ones you shared with me. Her last entry before the blockade went up, she wrote about a blue-skinned child who drew humans in the dust, who took her pen with such hope. She wrote, "Such small acts, but revolutions have started with less." They didn't know they were planting the seeds of liberation. Or maybe they did, Tira suggested, watching the children play in the courtyard, human and alien together. Their games combining elements from different cultures, creating something new. Maybe they knew that truth is patient, that it can wait centuries if needed, that children's drawings could outlast empires because empires are built on force, but drawings are built on hope, and hope is the most patient force in the universe. That night, Tira made an entry in the archive she'd begun maintaining, writing in multiple languages to ensure it would survive translation. Today marks the beginning of something we don't have a name for yet. Not peace, that suggests a return to what was. Not victory, that implies someone lost. Today marks the moment when the galaxy chose connection over separation, chose difficult unity over easy division, chose the chaos of freedom over the order of oppression. 50 years from now, someone will read this and wonder if it really happened this way. If a child's drawing in the dust really connected to a human captain arriving at the exact moment of destruction. If a grandmother's pen really survived 2 centuries to reunite 2 family lines. If hope really can persist through systematic oppression and emerge stronger for its time in darkness. To them I say, the facts matter less than the truth. And the truth is this. Somewhere in this moment, a child is drawing something impossible. Somewhere, a grandmother is telling a story that's been forbidden. Somewhere, someone is keeping a small promise that will become a large revolution. The scale doesn't matter. The act does. We are all the children who drew humans in the dust. Even those of us who drew other species, other hopes, other impossible things. We are all the humans who drew aliens in their notebooks, who imagined friends among stars they couldn't reach. We are all the ones who refused to forget each other, who knew that separation was the lie and connection was the truth, even when believing it cost everything. 200 years, children drew humans in the dust as fairy tales. Today, those fairy tales teach their grandchildren that every wall is temporary, every lie has an expiration date, and every act of hope is a revolution waiting for its moment. The dust has settled, the drawings remain, and tomorrow is always what we dare to imagine today. Tira of Keros, keeper of stories, teacher of hope, child of the dust drawings. As the stars emerged in the Kerosian sky, each one a sun to worlds where children now grew up together, Tira smiled. The air tasted of copper and wildflowers again, the settlement having been rebuilt with the same flora that had given it its distinctive scent. But now it mixed with other scents. Earth roses from the human quarter, Altarian crystal flowers that smelled of ozone, Verdani blossoms that released pheromones of contentment. She had been the bridge between myth and reality, the child who held hope when the world burned, the teacher who ensured the story would echo forward through time. The humans had returned exactly as promised, not as conquerors or saviors, but as fellow travelers who had also been lost, also been lied to, also been waiting for the walls to fall. And it had all started with a drawing in the dust, on a morning that had tasted of copper and wildflowers, when hope wore the face of a child who refused to forget what connection could mean in a universe vast enough to contain every possible form of belonging. The revolution hadn't ended with the Confederation's fall. That was just the beginning. The real revolution was happening now, in every mixed classroom, in every ship with a diverse crew, in every meal where different species shared their foods and found unexpected harmonies. It was happening in the marriages between species who'd been taught they were incompatible, in the children who grew up bilingual in languages their parents had never heard, in the technologies that emerged from combining different approaches to the same problems. Tira walked through the education center one last time before retiring for the night, checking on the dormitories where young beings of every species slept. She stopped at one room where a human child had fallen asleep, holding hands with a young Verdani, their different biologies somehow finding comfort in contact. In another, a group of children had built a fort using techniques from 4 different architectural traditions, creating something that shouldn't have been stable but somehow stood. This was the future her grandmother had drawn in dust. Not perfect, not without challenges, but real and chaotic and beautiful in its complexity. The fairy tale had become fact, but more importantly, it had taught the galaxy that facts could become fairy tales, and fairy tales could become facts, that the border between impossible and inevitable was thinner than anyone had imagined. Tomorrow there would be new challenges. Some species still held old grudges. Some systems still maintained quarantines. Some minds still believed in the old lies. But tonight, in a rebuilt settlement on Karos, children of every species dreamed together, their sleeping minds no longer separated by walls, their waking selves would never have to acknowledge. The revolution was complete. The revolution had just begun. Both were true because revolution, like hope, like children's drawings in dust, was not a destination but a process, not an ending but a constant becoming.